Imagine being asleep in your home when out of nowhere, FBI agents break down your front door, throw in flashbang grenades, drag you out in handcuffs, and hold your wife at gunpoint, all because they actually raided the wrong house. Now here's the kicker: when you try to hold the government accountable for that mistake, the government argues that you can't sue them because their agents had discretion in how they planned and operated that raid. This is the exact situation that went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and the court handed down a 9-0 unanimous ruling that could have big implications for everyone in the country. And now the 11th Circuit just reheard arguments in this case in light of what the Supreme Court said, and now they are set to rule on this issue. So let's talk about what is happening and developing in this critical case. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to subscribe. You can also hit the like button. That just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. Now, if you've been following the channel for a while, you will know that the Supreme Court recently issued a 9-0 unanimous ruling in favor of the Martin family, who were victims of an FBI wrong house raid back in 2017. Back in 2017, FBI agents executed a pre-dawn raid in a suburban Atlanta area against this family. Instead of going directly to the address on a warrant, the officer in charge decided to use his personal GPS device. I believe he put that into his iPhone, I think like Google Maps. And essentially that GPS routed him, in his words, to a completely different home and the incorrect address. And it took them to the home of Katrina Martin, where she lived with her boyfriend and their 7-year-old son at the time. When the FBI agents arrived at the home, they did not double check or confirm that they had the correct location. The officers claimed that there was no numbers on the house itself. They didn't take time to double check, the mailbox or the address there. They thought that the house looked potentially like the correct house. They thought maybe the vehicle was correct. And they didn't want to take any additional or extra time to confirm the house because they wanted to, operate quickly. They did not want to expose themselves, according to the officers. Like I mentioned, they broke in that front door, pulled out Katrina Martin and her boyfriend, who were hiding in the closet with a shotgun because someone was just suddenly breaking in the front door. They pointed guns at her, pulled her out half dressed, and also pulled out their 7-year-old son. Now, after the agents had detained the family, they did a search of the home, and while performing that search, one of the agents noticed that there was some mail on a coffee table, and that piece of mail had a different address. And that's kind of when they had this huge oh crap moment that we're at the wrong house and that we raided the wrong home. The officers then left the home and told the family that they would be back soon to explain, and the officers then went 3 homes down, which was actually separated by a cross street, so about a block away, and then they executed the raid against the correct home. Now, in response to this incident, the family sued the FBI and these agents. They brought a claim under the Federal Tort Claims Act, also known as the FTCA. The government claimed immunity under the discretionary function exception of the FTCA and asserted that this case must be thrown out. Now, on review, the lower court originally sided with the FBI and the government, but the Supreme Court decided to step in when they were requested to review this case, and ultimately the Supreme Court disagreed with the lower courts. The Supreme Court made something very clear in their ruling. You don't automatically get immunity just because law enforcement exercised judgment. The government has to show that those decisions were grounded in actual policy considerations, not just mistakes. Because of that, the Supreme Court issued a 9-0 unanimous decision in favor of the family, reversed the ruling, and sent the case back down to the 11th Circuit to apply the correct standard and take a new look at this case. So this case went back in the hands of the 11th Circuit after that Supreme Court ruling, and now the 11th Circuit has recently heard oral arguments in this case once again. And this is where things get very interesting for this challenge. The judges during those arguments focused heavily on one key issue: where is the line between policy discretion and basic operational failures? Throughout the arguments, several judges pressed the government on that very point, and one of the biggest questions was essentially this one here: how can executing a warrant at the wrong address possibly be considered a protected policy decision? The judges seemed very skeptical that something so fundamental like identifying the correct house on a warrant could fall under discretionary immunity and just be pure discretion, and therefore that mistake is covered. There were also questions about whether the government's theory would actually go too far. So in other words, if this counts as discretion, then what would not? Almost anything would be covered based on this type of discretion. Because under the DOJ's argument, almost any mistake during a law enforcement operation could be reframed as a discretionary judgment. And as one of the judges put it during the oral arguments, everything involves a person's choice or judgment. And if the government's line is followed, then everything would be covered under this exception. And that raised serious concerns from this panel. Another key line of questioning focused on the Supreme Court's recent ruling. The judges repeatedly pushed the FBI and the government to explain how their position was consistent with that ruling by the Supreme Court, and the government really struggled to give a clear answer. Now, at the end of those oral arguments, the court told both sides that it would let them know whether they wanted additional briefing on how the Supreme Court's ruling impacts this type of negligence issue. That was the main thing that we wanted to watch for in the following weeks after those oral arguments. But as of right now, we have still not received any order from the 11th Circuit requesting any additional briefing. And that is a very important signal, because if the court wanted some more briefing, if they wanted to do some additional briefing and maybe go back to the basics, we would have likely already seen that order after the oral arguments, because that's what the court said. But as of right now, we do not have any of those requests. So what does that tell us about this case going forward? Well, it strongly suggests that the court is not going to request additional briefing or kind of go back to the basics in this case. Instead, the court is likely moving straight towards a decision on this case. So in other words, the judges believe they already have what they need to rule on this issue. They don't need more arguments. They don't, need more briefs or evidence or anything like that. They're going to actively work towards ruling on this issue. Now, during the arguments, the DOJ essentially doubled down on the same position that was rejected by the Supreme Court. They claimed that everything leading up to the raid, including surveillance, navigation, and execution, involved discretionary decisions. And because no specific rule dictated exactly how agents had to verify the address, they argued that the discretionary function exception still applies in this case. But the judges did not seem to fully be convinced by that. And many of the judges said that getting, the correct address or even getting the wrong address on a warrant is not something that involves discretion. Now, on the other side, the plaintiffs made a much simpler argument. They told the court this isn't about policy. This is about a basic non-discretionary duty. You have to hit the right house on a warrant. That's not a judgment call. That's the bare minimum requirement when executing a warrant. And that argument appeared to really resonate with the judges here on this panel. So the biggest takeaway from these arguments is the judges seem very concerned about the consequences of the government's current position, because if the DOJ and the FBI wins in this case, it could effectively mean that wrong house raids are almost always immune from these types of lawsuits. And that would dramatically expand government immunity far beyond what the Supreme Court has allowed, not just in this ruling, but other cases as well. So what does this suggest about where this case is now heading? Well, based on the tone of the arguments and based on what the court there said after those arguments, there are a couple pathways right now. Most likely the outcome is that the 11th Circuit rules against the government and allows the Martins family's case to actually move forward. And, that was based on a dismissal of this case based on the FTCA and the discretionary function. But it seems like potentially the 11th Circuit is leaning towards allowing this case to move forward. Specifically, the court may draw a very clear distinction between protected policy decisions and basic operational negligence. There is also the possibility that the court will issue a very narrow ruling, a ruling that doesn't completely define the limits of the discretionary function exception, but makes clear that this kind of error based on getting the wrong address on a warrant is not protected at all. Either way, the government appears to be in a very weak position now after that Supreme Court ruling and after this new oral argument from the 11th Circuit. And now with no additional briefing being requested, like the court potentially mentioned, the timeline likely has accelerated towards a ruling on this issue. So this case is now at a very critical point. We have that unanimous 9-0 ruling by the Supreme Court. We have new arguments by the 11th Circuit in light of that ruling. And now we have a clear procedural signal from the court that they're likely not going to ask for additional briefing. Instead, they're just going to move directly to ruling on this case. So that's the latest update in this major accountability case dealing with this wrong house raid and this type of discretionary function exception and this type of immunity that the FBI wants to claim. As soon as we get more information at the 11th Circuit, potentially as they rule on this, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you'd like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.